Chapter 22. The Christians and the Roman Power, Commodus and Severus. We now return to the history of the Roman persecution, which, as we have seen, had some connection with the development of Montanism. On the death of Marcus Aurelius and the accession of his son Commodus, who affected the gladiator more than the philosopher, and was one of the most monstrously cruel rulers that ever lived, the Christians enjoyed comparative rest, a circumstance which is ascribed to the new emperor's concubine, Marcia, whom he treated long as his wife, and who, for some reason or other, was favourably disposed towards the Christians. At this time, it is stated, some of the richest and most considerable men in Rome went over to Christianity, but it is also recorded by the same authority, Eusebius, that a senator named Apollonius was executed as a Christian along with the accuser, his slave, the one being beheaded and the other suffering death by the breaking of his limbs. The influence of Marcia had led to no change in the law as it had been laid down in Trajan's rescript, and at the same time, as appears from this incident, the life of the slave who accused his master, as well as of the Christian who was accused, was extremely uncertain and precarious. But while the disposition of the emperor to spare the Christians did not, as can be shown from more incidents than the one just recorded, ensure an absolute cessation, it naturally caused a great mitigation of persecution. Under Septimus Severus, who came forth triumphant from the civil war which followed the murder of Commodus, 192 AD, it seemed at first as if still brighter days were dawning. According to Tertullian, and whether it is true or not, this must have been widely believed, Severus received into his palace a Christian named Proculus, who had cured him of an illness. Him the emperor kept constantly by his side, also protecting a considerable number of Christians in the capital, who would otherwise have been the victims of the popular rage. In some provinces, however, even during the 10 first years of Severus, during which he was favourable to the new religion, persecution broke out. And now, as many of the Christians had begun to redeem themselves with money, it was not unlikely to spread through the cupidity of governors, as well as the fanaticism of the multitude. But a change came over the emperor himself about the year 202 AD, and then there was begun by him a persecution so severe that many of the Christians imagined the reign of Antichrist to be at hand. It is impossible to determine with certainty the causes to which the change in the sentiment and disposition of Septimus Severus is to be ascribed, but an occurrence took place about that time which has led some to suppose that here again we may discern the bitter fruit of Montanistic extravagance. The occurrence was, at all events, the occasion of the first decidedly Montanistic production that came from the pen of the prolific, indefatigable, fiery African, who is generally designated the father of Western theology. It is not known where the occurrence took place, but it is believed, on probable grounds, that it was at Carthage. The occasion was the distribution of a donation which the liberality of the emperor granted to the soldiers. According to custom, each of the soldiers advanced crowned with a laurel to receive his share of the sum, but a Christian, whose conscience forbade him to wear the crown on his head, came up for his portion carrying it in his hand, an act which caused no little commotion. He was regarded as guilty of insubordination. Having been brought before the tribune of his legion and questioned as to the motives of his conduct, he openly avowed that he was a Christian, and declared that, as such, he held it unlawful for him to wear a crown upon his brow. The matter came before the prefect, and the soldier was sent to prison, where he expected, as it was expressed, the diadem of Christ, that is, the martyr's crown. Nothing else could be expected by a man who had not only been guilty of insubordination as a soldier, but had made a public profession of an illegal religion. This was a person after Tertullian's own heart, a true soldier of God, faithful to him when so many of his brethren in arms imagined that they could serve two masters. But according to Tertullian, a multitude of Christians disapproved of the conduct of the soldier as that of a misguided, vain, obtrusive Puritan who brought disgrace on the name by which he was called, and endangered the peace which hitherto had been generally enjoyed under Severus by the professors of the faith. But this disapproval by the multitude, Tertullian maintained, was quite in keeping with their treatment of the new prophets, the Cataphrygians. It was the same Holy Spirit as had inspired the oracles delivered in the last days that had inspired that soldier with the heroic courage of the martyr. I know the shepherds, Tertullian exclaims of those who thus put contempt on the operations of the Spirit. They are lions in time of peace, stags in the hour of battle. In opposition to those who disapproved of the conduct of the soldiers, he undertakes to defend it in his work De Corona, labouring to show that the wearing of a crown is not only opposed to the genius of Christianity and to the spirit which the contemplation of Christ's sufferings and death ought to produce, but unnatural and idolatrous. Tertullian has often excited wonder by the extraordinary way in which he heaps together arguments good and bad. The marvel is that a man who reasons so well on one page should reason so ill on another. In this particular treatise, however, it is much easier to find examples of bad reasoning than of good. The reasoning, for instance, by which he attempts to show that it is unnatural to wear a crown would, were it not preserved to us, be inconceivable in a man of his undoubted gifts. What enjoyment, he asks, comes from flowers, either fragrance or colour, or both together? And what are the senses of fragrance and colour? And what are the organs for these senses? The nose and the eye. It is therefore unnatural to put a garland of flowers upon the head. Put it on your breast, on your bed, or on your cup, if you will, but why on the head, where neither the colour can be seen, nor the fragrance enjoyed? You may as well bring food to the ear, or address sounds to the nose. But in this branch of his subject, Tertullian uses also an argument which, though it would hardly convince those who condemned the soldier, at least looks somewhat more rational. The wearing of a crown, he contends, is an act of treason against God, the Lord and Creator of nature. Doth not even nature itself teach a man that, if he wears a crown, he is putting dishonour on the divine majesty? Such vanities were abjured in baptism, when we renounced the pomp of the devil and his angels. Tertullian does not end his treatise without adducing considerations which do not indeed establish his point, but which, if his point were otherwise established, will be very powerfully used in inculcating and encouraging to obedience. He points on the one hand to the crown of thorns, and on the other to the crown of glory. If he has not satisfied the understanding, he knows how to take hold of the two most powerful handles by which the will of man is moved, gratitude and hope. I have dwelt on the incident of the soldier and the work which it evoked, because Tertullian's Montanistic tendencies were now fully developed and declared, and because at this time also the emperor appears as an active persecutor, issuing an edict by which both Jews and Christians were forbidden under the severest penalties to proselytize. It is possible that not only the Montanistic rigorism, manifesting itself in such a way as has just been indicated, but the Montanistic millenarianism, the enthusiastic preaching of the 1,000 years' reign, which might easily be represented, with or without malignity, as politically dangerous, may have had its influence on Severus. The edict which he issued contained, indeed, no express command to persecute those who were already Christians, but it gave too plain evidence of a hostile disposition, and the popular rage, which was continually demanding fresh victims, gave it, as might be expected, the widest extension, and indulged itself, at least in some quarters, without restraint. The chief suffering was in Africa, both in Egypt and in Carthage and the neighbourhood, proconsular Africa. In the former country, Leonidas, the father of the celebrated Origen, was put to death. As in the history of the Leonese persecution, so here, and as we shall see, at Carthage also, some women were conspicuous at once for their gentleness and for their fortitude. The case of Potamiena at Alexandria is extremely interesting. Eusebius, Book 6, Chapter 5. After she had been tortured in a variety of ways, she was condemned to the flames, and her body was destroyed from the sole of the foot to the crown of the head by the application of boiling pitch. A certain Basilides, who had led her off to her death and had been protected from the insults and abuse of the mob, was so deeply impressed by the meekness and steadfastness of the Virgin that he could not free himself from the thought of her agonies and her noble devotion. 3 days after the execution, the glorified form of the sufferer appeared to him in a dream, and put a crown upon his head, uttering the words, "I have prayed to the Lord for thee, and obtained thy salvation." He became a Christian, and soon had the opportunity of making a public confession, and of confirming his confession by his death. Happening to be involved in some litigation, he was required to take an oath by the gods. He refused, declaring that he was a Christian. Persisting in his declaration, which for a time seemed incredible, he was cast into prison, and the day after he was beheaded. It is related that others were converted in a similar manner, And who will affirm it to be a thing impossible, that the motions of the divine spirit should be felt when young men literally see visions, and old men dream dreams? That myriads of spiritual beings walk the earth unseen, both when we wake and when we sleep, may or may not be true. That among those myriads are the spirits of such as have fallen asleep may be thought an idle imagination, but that the departed appear in dreams to the living and speak to them is a thing which I suppose most men can attest from their own experience. Often are the words literally verified, "I sleep, but my heart waketh," going, it may be, after its covetousness or after its lust, and, what shall hinder us from believing it? Going sometimes after the God who made it and who seeks it. Most men, said Tertullian, thinking chiefly of Montanistic ecstasies, are brought to God by visions. That is an extreme view, but I see nothing in the nature of man, or in any rational, I may even say rationalistic, view of religion that should drive us to the opposite extreme and make us reject a priori every narrative of conversion by a dream as a pure invention. We cannot tell how often it may have happened during these 3,000 years and more that a man, on raising his head from his pillow, whether of stone or of down, has not had cause to say, "Surely the Lord was in this place, and I knew it not." Blunt says, "In no part of the world did persecution, rage more fiercely than in the region of Alexandria. It is, perhaps, by taking this circumstance into account that we get one key to the obscure and mysterious works of Clemens Alexandrinus, who wrote about this time. He evidently composed under entire constraint, a constraint, no doubt, in a great measure arising from the character of the readers he was addressing, educated and fastidious heathens, whom he hoped to approach with better chance of success if he disguised the Christian teacher in the philosopher, and Christianity in philosophy. Still there appears to be a reserve in him, even greater than this would explain. He speaks like one afraid to hear the sound of his own voice. Indeed, he almost says as much. "He dares not write it full," says he, "lest he should be found casting pearls before swine, who would trample them under their feet, and then turn again and rend you." The scheme of his principal book is desultory, confused, without system, expressly in order that the meaning of it should be deciphered with difficulty, a scheme suggested in some degree by the dangerous times in which his lot was cast, when he himself saw daily before his very eyes abundant spectacles of martyrs burned, crucified, beheaded, their conviction effected by the ordinary test of a challenge to deny the Saviour. But Clement, we remember, was the head of a catechetical school and a presbyter. His obscurity was no doubt caused by his allegorizing and metaphysical tendencies. About the time that Potaminea and others suffered at Alexandria, the persecution raged in proconsular Africa, where, however, 2 or 3 years before the emperor's edict was issued, some Christians were executed because, like Basilides, they would not swear by the gods. But after the appearance of the edict, Carthage, already conspicuous and destined to become still more conspicuous in the history of the Church, contributed to the noble army names of both men and women whose memory is still treasured. Names, too, of persons who, at the time of their apprehension, were only catechumens, not yet having undergone the rite by which the world, with its pomp and idols, was formally renounced. Of these it may be sufficient to notice the 2 of whose sufferings we have the fullest account, Perpetua and Felicitas. The 2 were frequently characterized as Montanists, but they were Montanists not yet separated from the Catholic Church. Perpetua was the daughter of a man who belonged to the higher ranks, and who, though he had not yet renounced the pagan religion, probably felt no deep attachment to it, as he does not appear to have used his authority in order to prevent his wife and his children from embracing Christianity. Perpetua was about 22 years of age. She had enjoyed the highest culture of her native city, was already married and the mother of a child, whom she took with her to her prison, at once her consolation and her sorrow. Not yet connected with the church by the outward rite, she seemed bound to this earthly life by the strongest and tenderest ties. Felicitas had not so many of the things that make death terrible, but the 2, partakers of a common captivity and a common hope, felt themselves to be one, and showed equal firmness and devotion. The father of Perpetua had made repeated efforts to bring her to a recantation, entreating her to spare herself the pain, and him the shame, of a public execution. Pointing to a vessel lying before them, "I cannot," she said, "call that vessel anything else than what it is. No more can I say anything else than that I am a Christian." She had adopted the principle of the great Montanist to whom Carthage owes something of its fame. It is not indeed a principle peculiar to Montanists, but Tertullian said to the Catholics whom he supposed to have generally forgotten it, "I know of no moral necessity but one, and that is, not to sin." After a few days, in the course of which clergymen found admission and administered baptism to the catechumens, the captives were consigned to a dark, miserable apartment, the lighter restraint to which they had previously been subjected being for some reason or other considered insufficient. Perpetua had no thought of abjuring, but for a time the joy of suffering for her Lord forsook her. She could not help shuddering. She had never been in such darkness. The excessive heat caused by the number of the prisoners, the harsh treatment of the soldiers, and the child on whom she could not cease to have compassion, all combined to embitter her sufferings, and she could not but pray, though in perfect submission, that the cup might speedily pass from her. If she afterwards called her prison her palace, it was not that dungeon, but another room obtained by the money of the deacons, ever ready to minister as best they could to those who were in prison. Again, the Christians were separated from the crowd of criminals with whom they had been shut up together, and now they were allowed to hold intercourse with their friends. Perpetua was all cheerfulness and joy. She had a dream, which reminds us partly of Bethel and partly of Mahanaim, and which is all the more likely to be truly recorded that it reminds us of both. She saw a ladder of wondrous height, reaching up to heaven, but so narrow that he who would climb must climb alone, and on the sides of the ladder, before each step, iron instruments were fixed, swords, spears, knives, and hooks, so that if one was heedless and did not constantly turn his eye upward, he was wounded and torn. And moreover, at the foot of the ladder lay a huge dragon, which ever sought to terrify the climber, that he might look back and fall. This was the dream of one whose baptism had been followed by sore temptation, and whose short life was soon to end with a second baptism, a baptism of blood. Before the trial, Perpetua's father once more besought her to recant. He kissed her hands and fell at her feet, but she could only answer that her life was not in her own hand, but in God's. When she appeared before the proconsul, Hilarianus, he too entreated her to have pity on her grey-haired father and her helpless child. It was hard to climb the narrow ladder with such swords and spears by its sides, but she held fast, looking not to the foot, where lay the dragon, but to the top, which was high in the divine faithfulness. Along with her fellow prisoners, who all made the same confession, saying, "We are Christians," she was condemned to be thrown to the wild beasts. The sentence was to be executed at an approaching festival, which was to be held in commemoration of the day on which, several years before, the emperor's son Gita had been received to the dignity of Caesar. It happened that, between the sentence and the day fixed for its execution, one of the prisoners sickened and died, and Felicitas, when suffering excruciating pain, was told that what she bore was nothing to what awaited them in the amphitheatre. "What I suffer now," she said, "I suffer, but then another will suffer for me." An exquisite piece of cruelty was devised to render the barbarous spectacle more attractive to the heathen. It was arranged that the condemned should meet the wild beasts, the men clothed as priests of Saturn, the women as priestesses of Ceres. Perpetua spoke for the company, saying, "For this very reason do we voluntarily give ourselves to death, that we may not be obliged to do anything heathenish." The tribune who was present yielded. Agnovit in justitia justitiam, it is said in the African Acts, and the prisoners, having given one another the kiss of peace, entered the amphitheatre as they had come from the place of their confinement. I need not give the details of the barbarous scene which followed. Various particulars are recorded, but I shall only mention that Perpetua, still living, but gored and bleeding, was borne to the gate of the amphitheatre, and was there met by a catechumen named Rusticus. She seemed as one awaking out of sleep, and looking up brightly, she inquired, to the astonishment of all, "When am I to be thrown to the wild beasts?" She could not believe that the conflict was over till she saw the signs of it on her body and her clothes, and yet, in the midst of it, she not only had helped her companion Felicitas, who had been thrown down, to rise, but had been seen again and again arranging her hair, probably scarcely conscious that she was doing so, but doing it, says the record, putting on the act a construction which is natural and beautiful, that she might not seem to be in mourning when so near her crown. The bones of the martyrs were buried in the principal church, and the day of Gita's festival continued to be celebrated, not in his memory, but in the memory of those catechumens whose baptism in the prison, followed so soon by their bloody death, was a photismos, spreading a light in which multitudes have rejoiced as glorifying to him who has chosen the weak to confound the mighty. I have not usually detained you with external events that have no direct bearing on the history of the Church, but I may mention that there was a people which provoked the wrath of Severus vastly more than the Christians, and which, toward the end of his life, he resolved to root utterly out of the earth. It was the Caledonians, among whom he had spread devastation without being able to subjugate or to restrain them, and among whom he sent a new army, giving orders for their extermination. Fingal, runs the account of Gibbon, is said to have commanded the Caledonians in that memorable juncture to have eluded the power of Severus, and to have obtained a signal victory on the banks of the Carron, in which he caused the son of the king of the world, Caracul, to flee from his arms along the fields of his pride. Something of a doubtful mist still hangs over these Highland traditions, but if we could, with safety, indulge the pleasing supposition that Fingal lived and that Ossian sung, the striking contrast of the situation and manners of the contending nations might amuse a philosophic mind. The parallel would be little to the advantage of a more civilized people if we compared the unrelenting revenge of Severus with the generous clemency of Fingal, the timid and brutal cruelty of Caracalla with the bravery, the tenderness, the elegant genius of Ossian. The mercenary chiefs who, from motives of fear or interest, served under the imperial standard, with the free-born warriors who started to arms at the voice of the King of Morven, if, in a word, we contemplated the untutored Caledonians glowing with the warm virtues of nature, and the degenerate Romans polluted with the mean vices of wealth and slavery.